At the end of the last lecture, I promised to show you how difficult it is for an English speaker to get out a sentence without borrowed words. In the previous lecture, I talked about the early borrowings in English from Latin, Celtic, and Old Norse, some of which are in the core of the lexicon, including pronouns like they, them, their, and basic everyday terms like mile, egg, and school. In this lecture, we'll turn our attention to the French words that poured into the language after the Norman conquest in 1066. With all of these language context situations, the vocabulary of English was changed to the point where borrowed words pop up at almost every turn in a sentence. Let alone, if we look at a paragraph, you're going to have borrowed words everywhere. Let me show you what I mean. To do this, I took the first novel that came to hand from the shelves in my library, which turned out to be Tom Perrotta's Little Children. I intentionally chose a novel rather than an academic book because I think we all have the sense that in academic discourse there are borrowed technical terms everywhere. A novel, however, is designed to be more accessible. And in all honesty, I figured that this would work, but I did not pick the novel strategically. This really was the first novel that I pulled off the shelf. So here is the first paragraph. The young mothers were telling each other how tired they were. This was one of their favorite topics, along with the eating, sleeping, and defecating habits of their offspring, the merits of certain local nursery schools, and the difficulty of sticking to an exercise routine. Smiling politely to mask a familiar feeling of desperation, Sarah reminded herself to think like an anthropologist. I'm a researcher studying the behavior of boring suburban women. I am not a boring suburban woman myself. So first, we could identify the Old Norse borrowings in that paragraph, which include the third-person plural pronouns they and their. Then, when we turn to the French and Latin words, we find them everywhere in the paragraph. The French words include the following: habit, merit, certain, local, difficulty, that might also have come in through Latin, exercise, routine, mask, familiar, research, study, behavior. The form of the word behavior is influenced by French. The word itself actually goes back to Old English, obey and haben. The Latin words in the paragraph are topic, defecate, school, polite, desperation, anthropologist, and suburb. And then just for good measure, there's one Italian word in the paragraph, which is favorite. You could do this with any paragraph in English. You'll notice that we almost got through the first sentence without a borrowed word. And I think that sentence feels deliberately straightforward to us in content and in word choice. That first sentence, the young mothers were telling each other how tired they were. It's probably not coincidental that all the words in that sentence are Germanic. After that, we would have to perform some serious circumlocutions to say what we want to say with all Germanic words. Let me show you what I mean. If we take a sentence like, this was one of their favorite topics, if I try to make that Germanic, I could come up with something like, this was one of their most liked things to talk about. Let me give you another one. The sentence in the paragraph, I'm a researcher studying the behavior of boring suburban women. I would transform that with all Germanic words into, I'm a deep learning kind of folk, finding out things about the ways of outside town women. You'll notice that to translate into Germanic words, I'm often relying on compounded forms, deep learning kind of folk, outside town. In the next lecture, we'll look at resistance to the Latin borrowings of the Renaissance, where some scholars were suggesting that Germanic forms could work just as well as the academic Latin borrowings, and they often were turning to Germanic compounds to replace the Latin borrowings. But before we turn to Latin, we'll spend this lecture on French, which after the Norman conquest infiltrated many of the nooks and crannies of the English lexicon. Now, nook, by the way, is, according to the OED, of unknown origin, but it's probably Germanic. Cranny is likely of French origin. The majority of French words that now appear in English entered after 1066, after William the Conqueror and his Norman French troops defeated King Harold and his English bands at the Battle of Hastings. And I'm going to give you just enough history to help you understand the ways in which these French terms came into English. So in 1066, William was crowned King of England, and England and Normandy were united under one ruler. For the next 200 years, maybe even a little more, England was governed by the Normans. The court in England spoke French, and the new nobility in England largely spoke French. The kings were sometimes bilingual. They would have spoken French and English, but some of them actually probably knew little to no English. And I want to add an important note here, which is that the French that William the Conqueror and the elite in England were speaking at this time was Norman French, which is subsequently called Anglo-Norman. It's a dialect of French. It's the French that was spoken in Normandy, and it has some notable differences from Parisian French. We'll come back to this because English has actually borrowed some doublets where one word comes in from Anglo-Norman French and another comes in from Parisian French. A logical question to ask at this moment in the narrative would be, why, if you have the Normans ruling England and speaking French, why didn't England become a French-speaking country? The answer probably lies in the demographics of the situation. It's estimated that probably no more than 2% of England's population ever spoke French at any particular moment. And this 2% of the population was largely concentrated in the nobility. As a result, there probably wasn't a lot of bilingualism the way we imagine there might have been in the Danelaw, where Old English speakers and Old Norse speakers were farming together, intermarrying, raising children together. With French, certainly some English speakers chose to learn French as a vehicle for upward mobility, but it was never an everyday language for the majority of people in England, which is why England remained an English-speaking country, and English survives the Norman conquest to remain the language of England and the British Isles. So French remained a language used especially in government, the judicial system, literature was written in French, and high-class pastimes were often associated with French, like fashion, sports, education, home furnishing, food delicacies. We start to see a shift in the historical situation in 1204. This is when the King of England lost control of Normandy, that Normandy went back to France. And the nobility who chose to stay in England, who gave up their possessions in Normandy, probably started to identify more with England than with France, and as a result to identify more with English and perhaps speak more English. The 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, only served to increase English nationalism and hostility toward the French and their language. And then there was the Black Death from 1348 to 1351. This killed somewhere around a third of the population in England, which is really a staggering number. This led to widespread labor shortages, which meant that English speakers often moved into higher positions with higher pay, bringing their English language into these positions. The plague also hit cities hard. These were people living in close quarters so the disease could spread, and among other things, resulted in a dearth of teachers who would have been teaching French, And that, again, contributed to the rise of English as a language of literature and of things like biblical translations. In 1362, Parliament not only opened for the first time in English, but it also enacted what's called the Statute of Pleading. And this statute dictated that defendants in court could have arguments presented in English rather than in Anglo-Norman so that they could understand what was happening in court. But 1066 to 1362 was a long time for French to be the language of the elite and of the government and court in England. And the effects of that are everywhere in the language. In the OED, it often looks like the year 1250 was a really key date in the history of English, that all these words arrived in English right around 1250. Now, there are a couple reasons for that. 1250 would have been a time when nobility would have been moving toward English and bringing French words into the English they were speaking. It's also likely that a good number of these French words were already being spoken in the language, and that it's not until 1250 and after that we have written evidence for them, that they get written down. French words have a healthy presence in the English vocabulary for politics, the law, and the economy. Again, not surprising when you think about the history after the Norman Conquest. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with politics. General words for government, including govern itself, come from French. It's like parliament, administer, court. While king is Germanic, many of the related words are French: crown, realm, reign, royal, and subject. Roles in the political hierarchy are French: noble, duke, baron, peasant, servant, and the verb oppress. Now let's turn to the law. As I mentioned, in 1362, criminal court proceedings switched into English from French, but French is still all around us in the courtroom. The people, the attorney, the judge, the jury. The proceedings: summons, evidence, accuse, advocate, convict, plea, acquit, verdict. And then the punishment: punish itself, prison, fine. Now let's do the economy. The word economy itself is French, and everything from money, finance, revenue, profit, to property and estate tax. And that estate tax, the heirs to whom that might be relevant, that's also French. I'll note here, though, that there are a few economic terms that are not borrowed from French. Loan comes from Old Norse. Borrow and lend are both native English words. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the way that French arrived in England, many words for war come from French, including the word war itself, as well as these terms: military, battle, defense, offense, troop, army, peace, and treaty. I would like to note that truce is an Old English word. I want you to note that the words I've listed here are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the categories in which French words pour into the language. It did not seem like an engaging use of our time together for me to rattle off long lists of French borrowings, but know that I could. French infiltrated the language of the church. You'll remember that we've talked about Latin borrowings coming in here, that the early borrowings associated with Christianity were from Latin. In the post-conquest period, English acquired such key terms as religion from French, as well as terms like saint and prayer, preach, repent, miracle, devout, faith and piety, salvation, confession, clergy, and baptism. So these are the borrowings in some of the more elite or specialized parts of the English lexicon. But this period also witnesses the borrowing of more common terms from French, including words for household furnishings, fashion, sports, and food. Again, remember that French was being spoken in England for hundreds of years, and so over time these words came in even for things within our homes. Within our homes, French words are things like a button and a blanket, when we put on our mittens, or the cushions on the sofa, lamp, chair, paper, mirror, towel, cellar. All of those are French. You might be less surprised that fashion has lots of French words: a dress, a boot, a coat, a jewel on perhaps your bracelet, ribbons, and cotton. Sports, we've got French words there: dance, chess, and checkers. Tennis, the prize you might win at the end, the racket you use, and just recreation in general. Now let's turn to food. The meals, dinner and supper, come from French, and then good things you might eat at those meals, such as bacon or oysters, toast, sugar, sausage, biscuit, fruit, and salad. Now, while we're talking about food, I want to tell you about a set of really wonderful pairings of English and French words that some people say are very telling about the relationship of English speakers and French speakers in the period. And these pairings are between the animal that you would eat if you're not a vegetarian, and so the animal when it's on the table and the animal when it's in the field. So, a cow in the field becomes beef when it's on the table. Cow is a native English word. Beef is a French borrowing. And this pattern holds with perhaps surprising regularity in other pairs. A pig, native English, becomes pork. A calf becomes veal. Sheep becomes mutton. Deer becomes venison. Chicken becomes poultry. And the anecdotal explanation here is that it was the English-speaking peasants who were taking care of the animals in the field and therefore giving them these English names or using the English words for them. And it was the French-speaking nobility who were getting to enjoy the animals as food. So cow, pig, calf, sheep, deer, chicken, all native English words. Beef, pork, veal, mutton, venison, and poultry are all French borrowings. You'll notice, however, that a fish is a fish and a lamb is a lamb, no matter whether it's swimming in the water or frolicking in the field or smothered in sauce for our consumption. And I'm interested in what's happened with poultry and chicken, that you'll hear actually both of them used for the animals when they're being taken care of and the animals when they're being eaten. There's another kind of pairing that dates back to this influence of French after the Norman conquest. And these are the double borrowings that I mentioned before, where one word comes from Anglo-Norman French and one comes from Parisian or Central French. So as I mentioned, the French speakers who came early, who came with the Norman conquest, were speaking a dialect of French, Norman French. By the 13th century, Central French, Parisian French, had become more prestigious and was coming to be used in the English court. It was, therefore, available for borrowings to come in. Now, the important thing here is that there were some systematic differences between the pronunciation of Anglo-Norman French and of Central French, and we see the repercussions of that in English. Let me give you some examples. Where Anglo-Norman French had k, Central French had ch. This is how we managed to borrow in cattle from Anglo-Norman and chattel from Parisian French, catch from Anglo-Norman, chase from Parisian French. A second systematic difference. Anglo-Norman French had w, where Central French had g. So this is how we double borrow warranty and guarantee, warden and guardian. It also explains the borrowing war. If you speak French, you may have been wondering when I said war is borrowed from French, and you think, but in French, it's guerre, which is true that in Central French, it is and was guerre, but in Anglo-Norman French, it started with a W, and so that's how we get war into English. There are also some pronunciation features of Anglo-Norman French that explain other borrowings that don't sound the way they should if you know French. So, for example, English borrowed quit and question from French. If you speak French, you know that these words start with que in standard French. Quitter, question. But in Anglo-Norman, these started with quoi, hence quit and question in English. Anglo-Norman also had airy or ori, where Parisian French had air and war. Let me explain here. In French, you have salaire in Central French. In English, because it came in from Anglo-Norman, it's salary. In Central French, victoire, but because we borrowed from Anglo-Norman, victory. So those are some of the systematic differences between Central French and Anglo-Norman French that allow English to actually borrow in two words from French that sound different in English. Now, some French borrowings really sort of surprisingly pushed out native English words. For example, uncle comes in from French, and it replaces the Old English word am. Speaks to, again, close enough contact that you would get a kinship term coming in from French. We see the French words envy and desire come in over the Old English word onde, which certainly could have survived, but doesn't. Old English had many words for nobles, including the word atheling. But that word died, clearly, you may never have heard it before, and now we have French words like nobles, noblemen, warriors, princes, and barons. All of those came in after the Norman Conquest. But there is one Old English synonym that survives, and that is the word lord. And it's worth pausing here for a moment to tell you about the etymology of lord, because it's a really interesting one. It's a compound in Old English and earlier, coming from hlath, which is loaf. If you lose the initial H, you can hear it hlath, loaf, plus ward, ward, or keeper. So a hlathward eventually becomes a lord. That's monosyllabic. It becomes monosyllabic by about the 14th century, hlathward to lord. So a lord is the keeper of the bread, or you could think about it as the breadwinner. Another legacy of all of this French borrowing are these funny sayings that we have, where we say the same thing twice, or at least we say close to the same thing twice. So if you take an example like safe and sound. Okay, how much of a difference is there between safe and sound when you say, yes, I got home safe and sound? What's happened here is that safe is a borrowed French term. Sound is a native English word. If you're not sure whether people will know what safe means, you might say, oh, safe and sound, because that's your backup plan. If somebody doesn't know safe, then they'll probably know sound. The expression give and grant is also a pairing that way. Give, Germanic, grant, borrowed from French. So those pairings help to ensure understanding. But we actually also sometimes have these expressions where you get two English words together, each and every. Those are both native Germanic words, and yet we pair them. Sometimes we also get two borrowings. So peace and quiet. So there you get peace from French and quiet from Latin, or null and void. That's null and void. Both of those, both null and void, come in from French. As I hope this lecture has made clear, the story of the English language is absolutely entwined with French. Now, I'm going to reiterate a point from the last lecture because I think it's a really important one. And that is that it just doesn't make sense to talk about an earlier moment in English when the language was pure. And I do hear critics do this when they're worrying about borrowings from Spanish or another language in American English or in British English. The story of English is the story of English speakers coming into contact with speakers of other languages. And English speakers continue to do this today. They've done it since before English became English. As you'll remember, English speakers on the continent were in contact with Latin, and then Celtic, and Old Norse, and French. And this continues around the world today. And that around the world is important and new. Historically, this was just happening in Europe, and specifically on the British Isles. It's now happening as English comes into contact with languages on continents all over the globe, and we'll be talking about the ways in which speakers then import words in all these different varieties of English, and we'll talk about whether that means we should be talking about one English, or as many linguists will call it, world Englishes. If we think about the phrase, the story of the English language, we can see in the wording the story of English and French in contact with each other. We see just in that phrase language contact at work, while the word English is native, and it actually means of or belonging to the Angles. And the words the and of are both native Germanic. The words story and language are French borrowings. And let me pause here for a moment on the word English coming from of the Angles. You'll remember that the tribes, the Germanic tribes that come over from the continent include the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. But the word that we use to refer to the language itself privileges the Angles, and that is the source of the word English. So, language is French, but the technical terms linguist and lexicon, these are Latin in origin. This is going to be a pattern that we're going to see in the language, where we see these technical terms often are Latin in origins. In the next lecture, we're going to turn to the Renaissance and this massive influx of Latin and Greek terms that happened with the revival of interest in the classics. So, and again, history here can help explain how we see these different levels of borrowing. What was it about the Renaissance that was different from the Norman Conquest that would put Latin terms and Greek terms in this higher register of the language than some of the French terms? One of the results of this is that we can get 3 levels of synonyms in English, where the English word is the most basic, the French is a bit fancier, and the Latin feels the most formal to us. So let me leave you with a set of these synonyms where I'm going to leave the Latin one blank and ask you to try to fill it in. So here it is. English, ask. French, question. Latin, what word did we borrow in from Latin to say much the same thing? In the next lecture, we'll look at some of these more highbrow, or some people might say highfalutin words that came into English from Latin, along with people's worries about these additions